This is the fifth and last in a series of videos covering the experiences that spurred me to question my religion and later to identify as an atheist. I'm hoping that reviewing my experiences will help to refine my thinking and create a record that I can look at later. I also want to create this video for family and friends who find out that I identify as an atheist. In-person conversations have frequently been quite frustrating, so I'm going to try using a video recording as a way to communicate the major experiences and thought processes that led to my non-belief. If I've linked you to this series, I hope that this will provide some context for why I identify as an atheist. Okay, let's jump into it. To start, atheism is only one facet of my identity. I also find personal meaning in learning about the cosmos and being curious, in being part of my family, and in trying to communicate and improve myself and my society. However, I consistently find that my self-identification as an atheist is the facet of my identity that disconcerts the most people. I can't even blame most people for their reactions, given how atheism is presented in the news media, on TV, and by pastors and ministers in certain congregations. Atheism, to put it bluntly, has a bad reputation. After I discarded my belief and faith, I chose for a time to identify as an agnostic. And in some respects, I still identify as an agnostic, because I can't disprove the existence of a general sort of deity or higher power. I do think that specific incarnations or conceptions of gods can be disproven, either as logically contradictory or as physical impossibilities. The tri-omni-God, omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and omniscient, is internally inconsistent. The three different categories of omni are impossible to have in one being, basically. On a physical level, Ganesh in Hinduism, if he's considered a physical incarnation, is impossible based upon our observed reality because a human body simply could not support an elephant head. However, any specific traits of any specific god can be redefined to avoid conflicting with reality. Most religions, for instance, moved deities and gods outside of the observed reality to a supernatural or metaphysical realm. Yahweh, for instance, isn't a physical old man in the clouds next to pearly or golden gates. Yahweh is instead conceived usually as beyond space and time. He is identified as immanent and yet immaterial throughout reality. Even logical inconsistencies can be avoided for most deities if a person's idea of a god is flexible. For most Christians I've met, though, are unwilling to give up the doctrine of a tri-omni God. Outside of Christian tradition, though, lots of gods aren't omnipotent or omniscient or omnibenevolent. Some conceptions of divinity, like pantheism or animism, don't even require a god with intent or consciousness. Simply put, many ideas of a higher power or a god or divinity in general are so vague and amorphous that disproving any and all conceptions of gods or divinity is like trying to nail Jello to a wall. I don't believe in the existence of a god is likely, but I have no method to disprove all types of gods in all types of religions or in all the cosmos. And in the absence of a working methodology to disprove all types of gods or God or a higher power, I identified as an agnostic. And yet I found that my use of agnostic confused people who were genuinely curious about my perspective. And the confusion boiled down to one simple fact. My use of agnosticism didn't completely coincide with the colloquial usage of agnosticism. Agnosticism in a casual conversation is usually identified as a halfway point between atheism and theism. Theists believe in gods. Atheists don't believe in gods. And agnostics are this midway point conceptually between atheism and theism, and are commonly considered uncertain either way. However, I used agnostic in a more limited way to define my conception of knowledge and certainty. And while I didn't think it possible to disprove all forms of a God, I also didn't think that all possibilities were equally likely. I wasn't an on-the-fence agnostic who wasn't sure about the existence of God or a higher power or the divine. I thought, and I still think, that it's way, way more likely that the cosmos and my experiences within it are based upon completely natural phenomena. And maybe someday I'll find new evidence with sufficient indicia of reliability to change my mind. But I'm not going to wait around for that. Identifying as an agnostic simply because I conceded a limited possibility of the existence of a God of some sort led to a lot of confusion. Because of how agnosticism is used in most conversations, people misinterpreted my statement as a sort of wishy-washy uncertainty about the existence of a God. People also assumed that I was agnostic about the Christian God, Yahweh, while I had long since concluded that the classical omnipotent, benevolent, and omniscient God was internally inconsistent. Conversations about this were difficult in the best of times, and confusions regarding my basic principles, my perspective on non-belief, certainly didn't help to form a meeting of the minds or allow for a good, engaged conversation. After a particularly frustrating discussion, I was going back through the conversation in my head, and I realized that we'd been talking past each other. It was quite clear when I was reviewing what I remembered that we had used the term agnostic in entirely different ways. And it was partly my fault for using a term that I knew had such a common colloquial definition that differed in such substantive detail from the way that I used the term. I decided that from that point on, identifying as an atheist more accurately reflected my thoughts and experiences. To try to give a little context around my thoughts, I'm going to borrow a concept from the scientific method. While it's imperfect, I think it provides some explanatory power for why I chose to identify as an atheist, despite an inability to completely refute the existence of a God. Anyway, in the scientific method, a hypothesis is a prediction or an explanation that is proposed by someone about how reality works that is tested by an experiment. And if our observations generally match what a hypothesis predicts, then we are said to adopt the hypothesis as far as its explanatory power within the experiment. But experiments don't always match what we expect. And in those cases, scientists and humanity have developed an alternative to the hypothesis, which is called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is simply that there is no relationship between the variables being studied, that the results of the experiment are likely due to chance, or are not significant in terms of the idea being investigated. On a strict level, I recognize that this is not directly analogous to my perspective on non-belief, because as far as my non-belief is concerned, my subjective experiences are not repeatable, although they certainly inform my non-belief and my values. Still, I think the analogy serves a useful function. My experiences have not established a God, or gods, or the divine. each time I tested my beliefs, whether in the Christian conception of God or Yahweh, or in spirituality, I found that less and less of any sort of belief remained. It couldn't be morality, because I know many people who try to be ethical without reference to a God, and morality varies widely from individual to individual. In fact, too often I have seen these strongly religious fail to consider the ethical implications of their actions and base their morality solely on edicts or orders from their ministers and pastors. It couldn't be facts and truth because there's no reason or way for me to choose one form of Christianity over another, or one religion over another. Unlike science, religions in general lack an internal mechanism for identifying and correcting errors. And I hate to say it, but from the outside of Christianity, it's quite easy to see some of the assumptions and weaknesses of Christian doctrine. Now, that said, some forms of Christianity have a much less doctrinal stance. And those people can sort of believe in it as a general tool for service or hope in a better life or things like that. At the end, I still try to just believe in hope and beauty, but I found that faith can deceive. And it's certainly not a useful tool for me to determine the truth of a claim or evaluate information. And it's too readily usable a blind spot for confirmation bias. Now, have I read every single religious text, considered every single article, or every possible permutation for God or deities or the divine? No. There isn't enough time in my life to waste it like that. And while I'm still interested in religion on a sociological level, I do have to live my life. And I did try hard to preserve my belief system at each step. I tested my faith against my ethics, my morality, my knowledge of science and the cosmos, and my personal